Um, Thank you for being here. So I think we are on the 4th day of the school, and we are beginning with a roundtable discussion. My personal aim is to maximize the time for the Q&A, so I will try to go I'll be minimalist in the other things. We have in total 6 speakers. I will introduce them fairly quickly. And I will introduce them in the order they will make their first initial remarks. So in terms of format, we have a first round between 7 to 10 minutes for each speaker, and then a second round where the speakers will comment on each other's first primary remarks, and then we'll open the floor for discussions. And for those, I think there is a paper circulating. If you don't have a copy, please ask for one. I'll talk about it in a second. Our speakers today are, we start with Dr. Faisal Devji, is Bate Professor of Global and Imperial History and Fellow of Balliol College, Oxford. Followed by Dr. John Keane, who is a Professor of Politics at the University of Sydney. And then Dr. Sari Hanafi is Professor of Sociology at the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Media Studies at the American University of Beirut. Then we have Dr. Aicha Basri, is a researcher at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. And then we have Dr. Gabor Scheiring, is Assistant Professor of Comparative Politics at Georgetown University, Qatar. And we conclude with, in terms of first round, with Dr. Marlene Laruelle, is Research Professor of International Affairs and Political Science at the Elliott School of International Affairs, George Washington University. Happens often in academic discussions that we talk past each other, and so by way of maybe minimizing that unfortunate but very often occurrence, we prepared 3 clusters of questions/themes. The speakers already have access to it. It's now I think you also have access to it. So the idea is to, as much as we can, in terms of speakers or audience, to try to revolve around these axes or nodes. There's no need for me to say more about that, but just very quickly, the first cluster is defining the terrain. What are we talking about when we criticize liberalism? The second is diagnosing the present. Novelty, diversity, contradictions, let's say empirical, on the ground, what is happening, or how we are reading what is happening. And then the third is envisioning future. From here, where to, and let's move away from the diagnosis. My interventions will be minimal, so I rely on the speakers. We start with Dr. Faisal, please.
Thank you very much. As a historian, I'm obliged to suggest that we've been here before, that there have been other moments in history where fears of liberalism's demise have been all important. And 2 of these moments are very familiar to us. The Bolshevik Revolution and the expansion of the Soviet Union, and the rise of fascism, which is a smaller movement. So first comes communism, and then in the interwar period, fascism. Now you might argue that liberalism survived these twin threats, but it didn't survive them without being transformed in the process. And so we might also perhaps speculate that liberalism already died a certain kind of death in dealing with the challenges posed by communism and fascism. And this is the kind of small death, if you will, that historians and lawyers today like Sam Moyn will describe when he writes about what he calls Cold War liberalism as a betrayal of earlier understandings of what liberalism might be, more radical understandings. You can add neoliberalism to this picture as well, as a way of thinking that seeks to remove democratic politics altogether, to subordinate the state to market rationality and to subordinate individual and collective mobilizations as well. So in this sense, maybe liberalism has undergone, or a certain kind of liberalism has undergone a small death. But perhaps it might be even more productive to imagine liberalism not simply as a way of thinking or an ideology that emerges in Western Europe and is insufficiently filtered abroad. Maybe liberalism achieved such success as it had outside Europe as well, at least in some respects. So when you look at a place I work on, colonial India, you see that what was not possible in England was possible in India. So for instance, the idea of a liberal state understood as a neutral arbiter mediating between interests and allowing for their contractual relations was not possible in England for various reasons. But it was possible in India. And someone like Gandhi criticized this form of liberalism by saying that the state mediating interests operated only to alienate these interests from each other and to augment their hostility to one another in such a way as to give more and more power to the state itself, whose violence then would be the only thing to keep peace between these interests, that the contracts mediated by the state were false. Right? But you could also look at the way in which John and I were discussing this a couple of days ago. Someone like Lord Macaulay, who writes the Indian Penal Code in 1860, inserts into it a principle that was not yet possible in England, which is to say secularism. All religions were to be treated equally. There was no established religion, as there continues to be an established church in England. And so you might say that colonial societies like India were secular before their European, if you will, masters. So this is another way in which certain fundamental liberal tenets might have actually achieved such reality as they possessed outside Europe itself. Now, if we take this seriously, then we might look at the death of liberalism slightly differently. So colonialism in some ways collapsed in a place like India precisely because the state could no longer perform its role as a neutral arbiter. It was distrusted by all the various interests it had put into place. And when it couldn't perform this role, it had to collapse. Today, we might be faced with a similar situation in other parts of the world. When the state has ceased to be a neutral arbiter, it is actively partisan. There are other ways, of course, in which we can think about this moment, one being a famous text like Marx's The 18th Brumaire, where Louis Napoleon rises to power precisely because there is a kind of inability of interests. There is no dominant interest at play. The bourgeoisie is not dominant enough, and neither are the classes in Marx's terminology. But if we were to revise that analysis today, we might suggest that it is not simply the fact that there is no dominant class or interest group available, and therefore, as Marx suggested, Louis Napoleon gets to be a kind of compromise candidate who, precisely because he was one, managed to lift himself above the society that had produced him and domineer all of its interests. But today we might be facing a different kind of situation, one in which interests or classes themselves have been weakened. And so you have a different understanding of what the failure of the neutral arbiter state might look like in the context of the decline of interest politics altogether.
Well, thank you very much, and Sabah el Khair. Good morning, everybody. I want to say a few words about topic 3, about democracy, demokratia, which Karim reliably informed me a few minutes ago is said by Beirut taxi drivers to be bullshit. So I'm going to speak a little bit about this bullshit concept, which has been lurking in the discussion for the last few days, and is a signifier that is attached to liberal, so there has been quite a lot of talk about liberal democracy. It may not be well known to you, but it is a neologism from the second half. It's a French neologism, démocratie libérale, from the second half of the 19th century, in which it's strange for us, but we should remind ourselves of the historicity of this phrase, which has been flourishing for a generation under the international liberal order. It meant not the democracy of the ancients, assembly face-to-face male citizens who are equals, regard each other as equals. And it did not mean what it meant for the Bonapartists, a Caesaristic democracy. It meant government that obeys opinion publique, public opinion. And this phrase, liberal democracy, as several historians have pointed out, appears at the moment that Faisal has just spoken about. It appears during for the first time on any scale during the 1930s, after the impact of the Bolshevik revolution and of Nazism, the small deaths of which you spoke. What I've tried to do in my work, I had a sad life, because mostly what I did intellectually in my life is write, broadcast, think, worry my head about the past, present, and future of democracy. What I've tried to say is, among other things, is that actually this phrase liberal democracy is not only a very historically limited phrase, but it does great damage actually to the language, the core precepts of democracy. In my long 1,000-page history of democracy, it's a dangerous book to read. You can be killed if it falls on you. I wanted to say that from that moment in the ancient cities of Syria, Mesopotamia, and its very first usages, democracy meant a political order, a way of life in which agents, individuals, and groups regard themselves as the equals, or should be regarded as the equals of others, that this equality principle, which is core to the meaning of the word until today, this equality principle is linked to the notion that nobody is good enough. No tyrant, no monarch, no autocrat, no despot, no emperor is good enough to rule indefinitely over people, because they are not deities or they are not gods on earth. And if they so regard themselves as superior, then they have to be resisted. This core idea of democracy has, I think, been through 3 historical phases. There is, of course, the earliest phase in which democracy is assembly democracy. Male citizens over 20, 21 gather as equals to decide how they will live on earth. Then comes, to cut a very long story short, a rupture, a reimagining of democracy that happens in the second half of the 18th century, where democracy comes to join forces, so to say, with the notion of representation. Democracy comes, to put it simply, equivalent to free and fair elections, periodic elections in which the people choose freely their representatives who govern for a short time and are then recallable. In my view, it complicates, the third phase of democracy complicates our understanding of the international liberal order, at the beginning of which, it seems to me, in the 1940s, the American-led international liberal order is a moment at which democracy is again reimagined. And I've looked in some detail at those controversies of the 1940s. It was the last great debate about democracy in which it's thought widely across the spectrum from Catholic conservatives in Latin America through to, let's say, George Orwell on the left. It's thought that democracy, yes, is a form of life, a way of handling power in which people can gather in assemblies. It is also free and fair elections. But the danger, it was said, of free and fair elections is that it gives rise to Hitlers of our times. And therefore, what is needed, according to this debate in the 40s, is the building of new institutions, watchdog, monitory institutions. And I call this, it's not very poetic, the invention of monitory democracy. Already, the UN institutions that are born in that decade are emblems of this. The marriage of the language of human rights and democracy never happened before. It produced, this reimagining produced new institutions like workers' councils in the German scene, and it still exists today. The idea is, in other words, a democracy is a polity, a way of life, in which abuse of power is dangerous and should be resisted. It should be tempered. In my work and in the last few days, I have been thinking about its spirit, to use the key word of Montesquieu. The spirit of democracy, it seems to me, is outliving liberalism. It will outlive liberalism. To say something very heretical in a winter school, democracy has no need of liberalism. It does things better. It thinks about power and how to govern and institutions better than the history of liberalism. This spirit of democracy I mentioned on the first day, it's alive in, for example, if you look at Vucic's Serbia at the moment. There is a major uprising, now 1 year long, that has been going on, where, for example, young people run all the way to Brussels or ride bicycles to Strasbourg. Why do they do this? Because they think that corrupt, arbitrary power is not cool. Or if you think about whatever you think about October the 7th and Hamas, one of the remarkable developments is that globally, thanks to public rallies, to journalists' reportage and so on, is the challenging of a dominant narrative of a powerful state that commits genocide. This is an achievement of this spirit of democracy. It should be remembered that democracy, seen in this way, has a certain elusiveness. Don't think of it as a synonym for free and fair elections or for deliberative assemblies. It's rather like water, more diffuse than that. It has no predefined form or substance. It's therefore wrong, I think, to imagine that we could be moving towards a world, or that it's imaginable, where a world where democracy prevails. I don't think of it like this. I think that's full of hubris. It's rather that the spirit of democracy, as I see it, is one in which paradise is not brought to earth, but where abuse of power is challenged, and there are efforts to restrain that abuse of power. In this sense, democracy for me is a universal. It has no grand first principles. Actually, a democrat is someone who is suspicious of grand principles. Liberalism, nationalism, socialism. I mean, these ideologies typically brought misery to the earth. Democracy is a friend of the contingency of power. Think of Tocqueville's Démocratie en Amérique. So you may not have considered this before. Tocqueville discusses the democratic revolution that America finds itself in the first quarter of the 19th century, in which he says, you know, the spirit of equalizing, the spirit of contesting arbitrary power will have effects on household life. The regard, the supposition that women are unequal is not sustainable in a democracy. Or slavery, he predicts correctly, cannot survive this modern democratic revolution. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is a way of thinking about what comes after liberalism. It seems to me that it is a norm, an idea, a precept, democracy, that is the friend of complexity, the friend of diversity, the friend of the opposition to arbitrary power. And built in, finally, Karim, sorry, is a precautionary spirit. If any organization, whatever it is, in China or elsewhere, has no accountability mechanisms built into it, you can expect that hubris flourishes and blindness happens and cock-ups, bad consequences follow. There is plenty of empirical evidence for this. It is, it seems to me, a new argument for democracy. Do not think of democracy in Plato's terms. You know, democracy is equivalent to a circus of monkeys. It's a ship with no navigators. On the contrary, the spirit of democracy is the friend of precaution in the way we regard our ecosystems, in the way we regard exercises of power. No democracy, if there is no democracy, then there is every danger of abuse of power, of foolishness, and of very often evil consequences. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please, Sari.
Yeah, thank you. So to keep the time, I wrote what I will say. So I'm the only sociologist here, so I will play the game. So I will give you a sociological account how to analyze the practices of liberals who are knowledge economy producers, whether in sociology, social sciences, academia, media, legal professions, and politicians, etc. But with focus on social researcher. In my book, I will do a propaganda, Against Symbolic Liberalism, a plea for dialogical sociology, I argue that the concept of symbolic liberalism is a contradiction in which individuals espouse classical liberal principles, yet act in politically illiberal ways. In the era of deepening polarization, social scientists often reproduce the very injustice they seek to challenge, taking entrenched positions while dismissing alternative perspectives. This has exacerbated the pathologies of late modernity, now all unfolding in a climate where reasonable debate seems increasingly impossible, not only in the global north, but also in the global south under the effect of globalization. In my work, I'm interested in Rawlsian political liberalism as a normative theory for governance and society, but I defend it as a thin theory, a theory with some core values, justice as a fairness, with its egalitarian and difference principles, and differentiation between the conception of justice and the pluralistic conceptions of the good. Other than that, I provided a critical assessment of when it went wrong as a thick theory adopted, theorized, and implemented. So I will provide two repertoires of a critique of symbolic liberalism. First, under neoliberalism, symbolic liberals distort the definition of justice by deflating the concept of social justice in the time when the economic, social, and cultural chasm between big cities' symbolic elites and peripheral populations grows ever deeper. Many social scientists become part of the leftist intellectuals of the big cities, what Musa Gharbi called symbolic capitalists. The left become cultural left, and when they are interested in justice, they downplay the importance of social class analysis while considering race, gender, and ethnicity. Second, if all members of a society should agree on one conception of justice, as it is related to how to balance between freedom and equality, is regarded including how society redistribute wealth, the concept of the good should be pluralistic and depend on final ends and aim which specifies a person's conception of what is of value in human life. It includes one preference regarding dress, food, using spare times, family, friendship, etc. Symbolic liberals indeed violate the distinction between the conception of justice and that of the good. They also consider only one possible conception of the good, a hegemonic one, that is sometimes packaged as an inherent part of the conception of justice. They inflate the conception of universality of human rights, seeing them not as abstract concepts, but concrete ones with little input from local cultures where they are implemented. Think, for instance, about the Muslim veil affairs in France. In order to impose their hegemonic conception of the good, they will extensively use codified norms, law, to place their adversary outside the bounds of legality. The empire of norms, to talk like Olivier Roy, tend to downplay how people actually resolve problems when a different conception of the good come into conflict. This dynamics is further aggravated by excessive identity politics with a subculturally fragmented and polarized society. This is why these days I'm interested in Taha Abdurrahman, whether there is a possibility of bridging between ethics and public reason, if you like, the cold public reason. So what to do? So I propose a dialogical liberal project, what I call, based on a renewed public sphere where diverse conception of the good engage in a genuine conversation while taking seriously the conception of justice in both individual and communitarian levels. I will focus how sociologists can participate on that. Sociology will be dialogical when it disentangles its commitment to civil society into two levels: the level of mediation or soft normativity and the level of strong normativity. In the first level, sociology provides scientific research that is important for public reason debates and for social movements. It is a moment of soft normativity as the very scientific questions themselves have normative presuppositions. I acknowledge that. It entails a possibility of providing knowledge to all civil society components, those we like or we don't like, governments whose action we don't always agree with. This sociology believes that despite the incommensurability of some modes of reasoning and political, cultural, and religious traditions, actors can engage with each other through a dialogue and reach sometimes overlapping consensus. The second level is a strong normativity, where sociology not only engages with civil society, but also takes a position in favor of marginalized groups against hegemonic power and defends those values dear to sociology. So I am worried, and this is why I wrote this book, when sociology analytically conflates the two levels and offer no distinction between providing scientific knowledge, critical thinking, and position taking or policy formulation, or worse, neglects the very level and become incapable of engaging with all strata of society. We become bubble. Being dialogical would involve all sectors, from urban planners who will recognize the city, reorganize the city to make different social class and cultural groups live together, to the social scientists, journalists, artists, fostering spaces of encounter of this group. Let me, in 2 minutes, just give you a case study. It's a chapter called Gender and Sexual Diversity, Embracing versus Celebrating. I start with a vignette about the football player Zakaria Abu Khal, who refused to wear shirts with rainbow-colored numbers, declared all his respect to sexual orientations. This story in France. All his respect to sexual orientation groups, but not participating on such campaign. The heavy punitive measure against him triggers on me that we should distinguish between embracing gender and sexual diversity in a sense of recognition, accepting, refraining from discrimination, versus celebrating it, which involved actively campaigning for it or considering it beneficial to society. This distinction is not anecdotal. It is a strategic approach to advance the right and societal recognition of vulnerable sexual and gender groups. I observe how individuals in Western democracies shift toward the right when they feel that symbolic liberals impose gender fluidity and sex spectrum as a fundamental principles for reorganizing society, framing them as a conception of justice. So the dialogical political liberal project seeks to contextualize sexuality and gender identity within cultural frameworks while adhering to the minimum standard of human rights established by Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other principles. This project operates through a process of disentangling gender discourse, addressing both gender fluidity and anti-gender campaigns by distinguishing between justification based on conceptions of justice and those rooted in the plurality of conceptions of the good. The project advocates for keeping the debate open on how to reconcile the perspectives of those who wish to express their sexuality in the public sphere with those who prefer to confine it to the private one. While the dialogical project, liberal project acknowledges and praise the critical role feminists and have played in advancing the right of women and sexual minorities, it's also called for greater tolerance of diverse feminist perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you. I would like to address the issue of, the question of the international liberal order, or liberal international order, from the point of view of institutions, rather from the meaning of the liberal. What is liberal? Because, as you know, there's a huge disagreement between all schools of thought, realist, constructivist, liberalist, on what it means to be liberal, but there is some agreement on what the international order, or what an order is. So different schools of thought agree that the international order is an organized set of relations between states embedded in international institutions. And here, this is the part that interests me, is the lens from the institutions, because it is very difficult to conceive the international liberal order without the institutions that hold it, especially now, where the major criticism to Trump and his administration, especially since 2017, the idea that he's withdrawing from this order and he's killing the multilateralism, which is the core principle of the liberal international order. So talking about institutions, of course, there are hundreds of institutions that hold this system, but the core one is the United Nations. And that's exactly where I want to argue that the UN history, norms, and practices gives us a few examples of the fact that the UN is at the core of the liberal paradox. And I argue that the liberal international order as set by the UN was rather driven by state power politics, state interest, and more about the state interests and power politics than values and norms. And in order to make this point, I would like to remind everyone of the history of the UN, of what originated at the beginning. Very few probably know that the original idea of the UN wasn't a United Nations organization based on the equal sovereign rights of the states, but rather the project of the 4 policemen. Roosevelt, when he thought about the new order, what he proposed to Churchill was a vision of a world in which the 4 victors, the US, Great Britain, China, and the Soviet Union, were to police the world according to hemispheres, respective hemispheres. In this order, the US would keep the peace in the Americas, Great Britain in Western Europe, Soviet Union in the Eurasia, and China in the East Asia. France was not part of the order because Roosevelt was opposed to it as a victor. That's another issue. It was imposed by Churchill later on. So this was the idea behind, the original idea of the UN, which was accepted to some degree by Churchill, but later on it was discussed, and because of the ideology differences between the West and the Soviet Union, and also because the threat, the beginning of talk about the threat of expansionism of the Soviet Union, then they agreed to move to a global vision based on the equal sovereignty of states. So this is basically the history. The origin of the UN was not sovereignty, it was not equality, it was not all the values that we will talk about later, but it was an imperial order based on hemispheres. And I would like, my talk, I hope I will have a chance to show that we're back now to the original vision of the world. We're back to the hemisphere and the power politics. So based on this global vision on equal sovereignty, the UN, the whole process of the setting up the UN led to the UN Charter, and the UN Charter said that the major principle is that it's the principle of sovereign equality of all members of the UN, and also the idea of peace, global peace, or collective security based on peaceful settlements of conflicts. Also, the UN Charter came up with a set of values, the equal rights to economic rights, social health rights, etc., the right to self-determination, or the principle of self-determination, human rights, rule of law. All of these sets constituted a liberal order based on a security organization with a set of values. However, and I would like here to cite 5 examples of the paradox that was enshrined in the UN Charter and in the practices of the UN, which show that this liberal order was flawed from the beginning. For example, while the Charter says that all sovereign states are equal, in practical, it sets an inequality between the member states, and as you know, the major problem now, it's been since the Second World War, was this veto power that was granted to the victors, the 5 powers, and which constituted a sort of an illiberal principle and practice within the UN. Another paradox is democracy. Democracy was missing from the very beginning. To this day, it is nowhere to be seen in the UN Charter. It doesn't exist, it was not discussed, and the very simple reason is that the founding fathers of the UN, I mean, you have just to think of Joseph Stalin, and you have a dictator. Democracy was not on the agenda. It was never on the agenda. And probably more shocking is that the human rights itself was not on the agenda. When the first draft of the UN Charter was presented in Dumbarton Oaks in 1944, the word human rights didn't exist. And guess who fought for it? It wasn't Western nations who were imperial powers. It was Latin American countries and organizations, NGOs, backed by some American and European NGOs. This is also one of the myths that the Western order, the human rights system, was built by the Western powers. That is not true. The other paradox is also the human rights paradox. The founding fathers of the human rights system were Zionists. And let me give you just some names. Jean Cassin, the main drafter of the Universal Human Rights Declaration. Lauterbach, who's the founding father of the international law. Peter Benenson, the founder of Amnesty International. Raphael Lemkin, who was behind the Genocide Convention and fought also for the ICJ. All of them were active Zionists, so how could you be liberal? And how can you set up a human rights system while you're a Zionist? That's another paradox. The fourth paradox is the U.S. disengagement from the liberal, of some tenets of this liberal order, which is international law and international justice. To this day, the U.S. has refused to accept the jurisdiction of the ICC. It has actually been fighting it, let alone a set of treaties and conventions on social welfare, human rights that is not part of. So that's our fourth paradox. And the fifth one is the UN membership itself. So we have liberal states, and a large number of liberal states, but you have much bigger number of illiberal states, let's say undemocratic or dictatorships that are part of the UN, active members of the UN. So you have an organization, a core multilateral organization that hosts this international liberal order, which is a hybrid liberal and illiberal in membership. So I would like to conclude here at this part by saying that the liberal international order is flawed, and at best it is hybrid. And also the second point I would like to flag here is that the UN, setting up the UN, didn't stop the power competition during the Cold War. In fact, there was another order, some call a bounded order, made by 2 blocks, regional blocks. We had the Western states versus the Soviet-led states, who had, both of them, they had opposing and competing organizations. On one side, you had NATO. On the other side, you had the Warsaw Act. You had the GATT for the trade. On the other side, you had the Camicon, Bretton Woods on the western side, and you had the International Bank of Economic Cooperation. So you had the international, the existence of the UN, and the fact that both blocs belong to the UN and did share some principles and try to balance power within the UN. They also try to balance power outside the UN while competing for spheres of influence. This situation was sustained until 1989, of course, when we moved to the unipolar moment where we saw an imbalance of power and accompanied by the neoliberal order, of course, promoting free markets, privatization, minimum government intervention, etc. Also, during this neoliberal, and not liberal, neoliberal order, the democratization efforts, what some would categorize as a third wave of democratization, took effect, including by coercion in the Middle East. And the Iraq was the best example, and Afghanistan later. And then by 2017, this unipolar moment began to face a different scenario, which is the return to the competing power politics with the rise of China as the new power and the resurrection of Russia. So since 2017, we've been seeing some retreat of the UN. We've seen it with the League of Nations. Whenever there are competing blocs, the UN doesn't have the consensus that it takes to make decisions. So the power is between, or the competition is between the US-led order and a competing order which is almost parallel, led by China. And this takes us, I mean, we can talk later on about Greenland. Greenland is, for me, it represents the beginning of the cycle, or the end of this cycle that we saw since the Second World War. We're back to the hemisphere competition. Greenland is the test, is the last test for this international order. If it's taken, then the liberal international order, it's over, and we're back to pre-Second World War scenarios. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, Gabor.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I will try to respond to all your three questions directly and briefly also, maybe if I can relate to what I've heard so far. So let me begin by responding to your first question, what is basically liberalism, before we identify what is in crisis. So my take on this would be, as I mentioned 2 days ago, that I think social science has a little bit forgotten the material foundations of ideas. So I'm a sociologist, Sari, so I kind of am influenced heavily by sociology. So, you know, you could think of this as a kind of a relational materialism, bit of Marx, Polanyi, E.P. Thompson, Stuart Hall, bit of the French regulation school. Just to give you signifiers, I don't have the time to explain this, but the idea is not that ideas are unimportant. They're very important, and they're not just simple fig leaves. You know, structures do not come with an instruction sheet, as Mark says. So they do play a role, but they unfold in a material, historical material context. So I would say that liberalism is like such a historical, political, economic project, and I would approach two sides of it. One is kind of it legitimizes orders and facilitates collective action, these ideas. So in terms of legitimizing orders, I think it's helpful to think of, you know, first came the enclosures, dispossession, exploitation, and then came Locke's idea of the sanctity of private property. So I don't think, in other words, the rise of this kind of economic system that we have today is some kind of universal, the unfolding of some universally explicable law. In terms of facilitating collective action, you might think of I don't think Keynes's ideas, Keynesianism directly changed economic governance. I think it helped change governance because it facilitated the organization of social coalitions that could then put pressure on the state. So I think what my argument would be is to think of liberalism as kind of something that lives in this kind of relational material sphere of power. Second, I think looking at the specific ideational components, it has at least three important ones. Economic liberalism, obviously, most of it I mentioned, freedom of exchange, private property, but also initially kind of the equality or equity of chances as capitalism unfolded had a progressive element to it, kind of dislodging feudal privileges. Social liberalism is kind of freedom of identity and kind of equal recognition of identities has become very dominant these days. And political liberalism, freedom from despotism and political equality and kind of institutional procedural fairness. Now, I don't think that this political liberalism is equal to democracy. So in that sense, I very much agree with John that what we came to know as liberal democracy is a very specific historical product that emerged in a very specific historical material context around the Second World War. And we take it for kind of the only possible form of democracy, but that's just not true. And also it's not the only possible form of liberalism. Maybe we can get back to this. But it's just good to think of the liberal democracy as a very specific historical material kind of phenomenon. Now, what is in crisis? I would say what is crisis is a very specific instance or stage of this project that we could call liberal globalism, which is a globalized system or regime of accumulation that arose as elites kind of rejected the various forms of the social compromise that restricted capital accumulation and pacified societies and made liberal democracy possible in the middle of the 20th century in Western countries, but also facilitated democratization outside of the West. And this also means, I very much agree with Aicha, that what we came to know as global governance was never universal. It was very much facilitated, especially from the 70s and 80s on, by this kind of reclaiming of the power of Western corporate and economic elites. So this kind of global economic governance is very much in the service of this 0.1% of the top 1%. You know that in the US, the 0.1% of the top 1% owns almost as much as the bottom 90%. And this is the consequence of elites saying no to the previous social compromises and utilizing global governance and global structures of accumulation and exploitation, economic liberalization, financialization, the whole neoliberal story is kind of this elite project. And this is in crisis because it has eaten up its own kind of democratic foundations. So in terms of the crisis, I think, again, it's very important to see the material foundations. I like to put this as international integration, very often, especially if it's misgoverned, it's not a universal law, but it has a tendency to lead to domestic disintegration. It's not that economic globalization leads to more poverty. Some countries benefited in terms of absolute poverty reduction, especially in the global south. I'm not saying that. But what I'm arguing is that it more leads to economic disintegration, inequalities, but also culture and symbolic kind of disintegration of societies, creating of a kind of anxieties where middle classes no longer feel closer to lower classes. And you can see this unfolding in countries like the Philippines, in India, where middle classes like want to embrace globalization as opposed to what they see excessive claims of lower classes. So that's a kind of international economic integration facilitating domestic disintegration. And that's, I think, crucial. And of course, we know the most important lived experiences of this in the West, the industrialization, the whole wiping out of ways of life in the industrial West. West Virginia used to be a democratic stronghold, now it's Trump land. The whole Midwest in the US. But that was a story in Eastern Europe, in Hungary, in Russia. And it's not just losing jobs, it's also, if you take the average 80s mortality rates and say that should that average mortality rate continued in the 90s, you would have seen more than 7 million Eastern Europeans more surviving the 90s. That is, 7.5 million Eastern Europeans died prematurely as a consequence of post-socialist economic shocks. So that's a massive lived experience of crisis. This, of course, fundamentally eats up the foundations of democracy. It unfolds through time, so these effects are not immediate. It takes time to kind of filter through politics. And this material crisis, kind of ended the legitimizing power of a specific configuration of liberal ideology that attempted to bring together social, cultural liberalism and economic liberalism and a very narrow definition of democracy, which is a very procedural, institutional, formalist definition of democracy. And I think that's very important to see that this kind of, Nancy Fraser calls this progressive neoliberalism. That was the ideological kind of legitimation machine of this globalist project that is now in crisis. So the last question then is, what can we do? Just very, very briefly, 5 points, I think. First, I think this cultural turn into social sciences did a disservice in kind of not really helping us understand what is really in crisis. So I think we need to kind of really reconsider this relational materialist foundation of political projects, the social coalitions that make democracies possible. Democracy is always a social compromise between kind of competing social actors, and that's just very important. It's not, it's not great ideas, great men, typically great white men with great ideas and write a constitution. That's not democracy. Democracy is social groups reaching a compromise, and that's how it works. And when that compromise ends, democracy also is in crisis. So that's one thing. And a lived experience is crucial. I too often hear Western social scientists, but also political elites kind of denigrating lived experiences of working class people. Like when they're complaining about their economic plight, they're just saying, oh, you should be happy. You're living such a better life than 50 years ago. There's no really crisis, big economic crisis unfolding. You're just racist. That's why we have the far right. And I don't think that really helps us. So we really need to take lived experiences seriously. This is also, I think, a crisis of this centrist liberalism. So it has really ended the progressive imaginary. So we need really transformative narratives that lead to kind of caring democracies that take people's needs really seriously. And finally, we'd have to take the kind of the universal, the cosmopolitan aspect of this again very seriously. And here I just agree with Faisal how Western liberals like to think of themselves as, the inventors of ideas like, I don't know, we should all respect each other. Wow, that's a great idea. No one has ever thought of that before. Thank you, Westerners, for bequeathing this brilliant idea to us. So I think we should really take this kind of global and universal aspect of it seriously, and I don't see the crisis of global economic governance as a problem, but the illiberal reaction to it is a problem, that we don't have kind of a progressive democratic answer, and we need to kind of reclaim that transformative space and build a truly universal and cosmopolitan order if we want to kind of salvage whatever there is to salvage from liberalism, that is the political and social aspects. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So many great things have been said. So I will try to follow very briefly with some very short points on liberalism and post-liberalism, mostly following what Gabor and Faisal said. I think that if liberalism already went through several small deaths and survived the transformation, as Faisal was telling us, I think the scope of today's challenges is really a different one. Right? Because during the interwar period, the challenges coming from fascism and communism to liberalism, they were all sharing the same modernity cradle. Right? They were all coming from the same vision. They were all believing that nation state is the relevant kind of element, even if for communism it was slightly more complicated. They were all being a product of mass culture born with the 19th century. They were all believing you can extract resources from nature endless. So they were sharing a lot. I think the scope that we are facing now for liberalism is much more than that. That this same cradle is kind of not functioning anymore. Right? The nation state is no more the relevant, or at least it's struggling to be relevant, but it's facing difficulties for that. And the problem is that we exist as citizens, not of the planet, but as citizens of one country. So there is still only one way for us to kind of express ourselves in terms of kind of political right. It's still through the nation state, and that nation state is having a smaller and smaller capacity to act and change the world. The idea that we can extract resources from nature endless is also coming to a term. We are all belonging to the same kind of material mass culture, but we live in micro-epistemic communities, and the artificial intelligence will soon be changing the kind of core component of our humanity. So I think the scope of challenging for liberalism are really from a totally different level than what we had in the interwar period. So it's not that liberalism doesn't have way to answer to, for example, authoritarian experience, but it has no answer to these existential issues that it's facing, and it has also, I think, difficulties at finding answer to its own contradiction. And if you think that, for example, we are living now in a kind of what has been called this kind of surveillance capitalism is a product of the US tech industry, right? So a core country that presents itself as one of the historical core of liberalism has been producing a world in which we are living where the technologies are going against liberalism as a kind of philosophical principle. And the fact that coming both from China and from the Silicon Valley with some nuances, but we see a kind of shared trajectories toward some form of digital authoritarianism, I think it's telling a lot about the kind of the scope that liberalism has to face and its own kind of evolution. And I think on that, it doesn't really have any kind of answer to this kind of transformation. So that was my first point on the crisis of liberalism. And then now on this notion of post-liberalism, I think if you use it as a thin definition, we are in a post-liberal moment, in the sense not that we had a clean break, we had liberalism, at least in some countries, or at least presenting itself as the kind of the normative center, and then it's break, and then we have something else, right? But if we think the post-liberalism as it's the end of the cultural hegemony of liberalism, and now we have ideological simultaneity of different political offer, then we are already in a post-liberal era, and we will stay probably for long. That is, that there will be pluralism in ideological experience and political kind of offer that will be put on the table for citizens, at least in countries where they can have some choice in making some decision. If we want to have a more thicker definition of post-liberalism as a concrete political project, well, first, I think it will have another name. It would be difficult to imagine a reinvention of democracy that would be post-liberal, that would call itself post-liberal. It sounds weird to have a definition that is kind of just a reference to the previous one. But you can see some element that probably a large group of people would like to preserve, right? Everything related to civil liberty, pluralism, accountability, being protected for the arbitrary of power, but also where that will be some change would be to have a more kind of relational definition of individual autonomy, more perception of common good, more shared decision-making, a democracy that would be caring, as Gabor was saying. I think the problem of that kind of post-liberal political project is that it needs collective restraint. And collective restraint, I use it in the sense that it needs to be a kind of post-growth aspect. He will have to integrate the kind of planetary limit, and that's where it's difficult if you are functioning in a more or less still democratic, or at least with a pluralistic political offer. It's difficult to explain to citizens that there will be, your future is a future of restraint and limits, and not having that presented as, or not having that being lived as a loss. And so I think that's one of the challenges that many of these kind of, at least post-liberal projects that care for environmental issues have having difficulty, that our identity as citizen has been largely replaced by an identity as consumer. And the fact that that will have to be deeply challenged and transformed is a difficult sell to do for us. So for that, you would need a really kind of strong cultural work to change what are the habits, the values that people would care for and be ready to kind of see sacrifice in the name of getting something different. The problem to kind of imagine this kind of post-liberal political project is that there are many forces that don't want any reinvention of democracy, and these forces are very powerful, and they are coming from very different ideological background, being the Chinese model, or the kind of the classic authoritarian model, or the more kind of forward-looking Silicon Valley kind of digital control model. And the problem, and I will stop on that, is that these forces are mastering the time, right? They are the one creating the acceleration of history that we are facing now. And the problem of democracy is that democracy is slow. Democracy doesn't master the time very well. And so that's, I think, one of the contradictions that we have now for democratic system, is that they are losing the battle of time and chronology, and therefore the more we kind of wait, the more we will probably, at least the societies that were defining themselves as liberal democrats, which are the minority on the planet, will probably all have to go through a phases of illiberal authoritarian experiment that will change the lived experience of many people for sometimes better condition, sometimes worse condition, before you can imagine having something that can be kind of reinvented. So I think we are at that kind of moment where it seems to me, at least for liberal democracy, that there is a kind of historical, kind of almost kind of Marxist dialectical moment that you need to go through an illiberal experience to kind of imagine the kind of shock that we need for societies to be able to reinvent themselves. But the question of mastering the time and mastering the kind of the world of digital infrastructure and technological transformation that are coming are, I think, the biggest challenges that we will have to face for reinvention of democracy. And I think on that, liberalism has no answer, because liberalism has been embracing largely this kind of digital technological transformation, and that's one of the elements where its philosophical project is going against its own kind of concrete realities in many of the contemporary world. I will stop here.
Sorry. Thank you all. Before we go into the second round, which will be a much, say, shorter, 3 to 5 minutes by each speaker, in the name of academic devil's advocate, I would like to raise a challenge for everyone by defending liberalism in light of what has been said. And the defense is based on two claims. The first claim is a distinction between what you might call the general level, principles, ideals, concepts like equality, freedom, democracy, human rights, on the one hand, and the actual instantiations of these concepts, by understanding equality as requiring same salary for men and women for the same job. This is a particular instantiation of the idea of equality, at least in the, in the office. So why this is helpful? Because, or how is this an objection or a comeback for the liberal? The liberal might simply say, everything I heard today is simply an indication of anti-particular understandings of liberalism. You have not given me any kind of reason to give up on my core principles. that the individual is central. Okay, we might disagree on is the individual, should we understand it in a completely atomistic way or in relational terms, but we're still within the core notion. Similarly, you would say for equality and freedom and justice. And just to complete with this idea, say if you insist that what you are saying is actually because of the instantiations of liberalism in the current world or in the last 100 years are all bad, then you must also apply the same kind of logic to democracy, to Islam, to human rights, so that also has to be given up. If the instantiation is of these concepts, ideas are the problem, and the result of attacking these instantiations is giving up on the principle, on the concept, then you do this consistently. So now I want to, the second point, I want to focus more on the applied level. And this is maybe in the spirit of how crisis is not only crisis, it's also an opportunity. And the question of what is next, right? This is where I think we should think in terms of crisis as an opportunity. Now, to put together some of, I mean, it's obvious that the speakers want to figure out a way forward, right? And we dismissed some options. And here, I mean, just because of my discipline in political theory or political philosophy, it seems that the reason why all these particular instantiations of liberalism have failed is they never really took seriously the challenge of someone like Carl Schmitt, which I think connects us to the existential, to the lived reality. And for Schmitt, he would say, listen, it's a matter of fear and anxiety. People want certainty, they want determinism. You cannot just leave things open. And in that sense, politics cannot be grounded neither on law, nor on ethics, nor on rationality, right? So unless we come up with a political vision that can somehow square the general principle of things like equality, freedom, I'm assuming everyone wants that, and that in a way that can answer to the lived reality, maybe you can put it in terms of progressive, democratic, it doesn't matter the names here. But we need a way to square that. And I think this is what explains the rise of the far right. I mean, they are not the only ones who are trying to give up alternatives, but they are the only ones who have they are being received in such a, strong way. And from that Schmittian perspective, he would say, of course, there's no other option. They want authority. Basically, you want an authoritarian. This is the kind of spirit. So I wonder what the speakers, I don't know, should we go with the same order? Okay, so we start with Faisal.
Thank you. Sorry. I have a couple of comments. One to Marlene. I really liked what you had to say. But, I was thinking when you were talking about the post-liberalism, how it is that, intellectually speaking, if I'm not mistaken, structuralism was the last intellectual movement, serious intellectual movement, which owned its own name. Everything else has been post, neo, or de. Deconstruction, decoloniality, postmodernism, postcolonialism, neoliberalism, etc. And it reminds me of something Habermas says in his book, The Philosophical Discourse of Modernity, where the idea of modernity is premised upon a fundamental rupture in history. But the problem with this premise is that it sucks every other kind of rupture within itself. So everything subsequent to the modernist break is always simply another version or a part of the modernist break. And it just makes me wonder whether this inability or unwillingness to think about the new in its own name really tells us something about the difficulties that a historical imagination faces. And my second comment has to do with both what John raised the issue of Gaza, and Aicha raised the issue of international liberal order. And it struck me that it might be somewhat heretical to say this, but the greatest protests, pro-Palestinian protests in the world have all been in the West, in Western Europe and in North America. The global South, minimal. The Muslim world, if such a thing exists, almost non-existent. This is not simply because people are afraid or they live under governments which don't like mobilizations. And it makes me wonder whether, given both what Aicha and John was saying, that the protests as defined in the West are actually protests that are defined completely by the failing liberal international order, that they no longer make sense to people outside. This is entirely speculative, because of course they're humanitarian. They tend not to be political in a certain sense. They are about the upholding of international norms and international laws, definitions such as that of genocide, BDS, which is a form of sanctioning that the UN is meant to do, but that now civil society conducts on behalf of the international order, which is unable to do so. But when you look at political movements in the global South especially, they tend not to be driven by concerns over human rights or the international liberal order. So that the Palestinians, even though they enjoy a huge amount of sympathy, seem to have gone the way of the Rohingya or the Uyghur, right? You can sympathize with them, but you're not going to mobilize on their behalf. It just makes me wonder whether what we are describing as the crisis of the liberal international order finds in our time its most exemplary manifestation in the loss or the absence of mobilization, both among Muslims globally and in the global South more generally, for a cause which has historically been a hugely important cause for them all. And I think, I would like to hear what people say about this. Iran, of course, and its allies are the only countries which do have an alternative political understanding of the Palestinian problem. But even there, you see with the current protests, people are chanting in the streets, no to Gaza, no to Lebanon, Iran first. Yeah? So even there's been a discrediting of the only political mobilization. I wonder if we can think through the Gaza problem as exemplary for the general problem where we are dealing with. Finally, I think, Aicha, again, I entirely agree that the Cold War hemispheric order really defined the United Nations. But the problem today, I wonder, is if Russia and China do not yet, if they ever can, represent a kind of alternative hemispheric order of the kind the Soviet Union did. If it did, then you could go back to a balance of power politics, which is what the UN system was all about. But you cannot yet. It makes me wonder whether this system can be rescued at all. And the whole point of, as you noted, the whole point of the system is that it doesn't have to be uniform. It's political. It's based on a compromise. Not everyone needs to be a democracy. Not everyone needs to be, they're not homogenized in any way. The only principle of homogeneity is that they all have to be defined as nation states, even if they aren't, and there are many that aren't actually, there are countries that are absolute monarchies, there are countries that, all the rest. I would like to hear more about that as well.
Thank you. John?
I have two comments. One to Aicha. I feel uncomfortable with myself to be defending the United Nations, but it does seem to me that your account, with great respect, of the formation of the United Nations is rather one-dimensional. It was a very complex, messy process, and I've looked in particular at the drafting of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, where actually ratified in December 48 eventually, you know, the drafters of that declaration did use the word democracy, and they did not think in terms of sovereign statehood principally. The languages of dignity and freedom and equality and so on. And the drafters, John Humphrey, a Canadian disabled lawyer, was the chair of the drafting committee. Pan Chun Chung was a student of John Dewey, a Chinese playwright and philosopher. Shal Malik, a Lebanese Maronite, I think, was central to this. So it was a much messier process. And the other thing I wanted to say is that by privileging, so to say, or by centering the United Nations as the core of the international liberal order, forgets, it seems to me, that again, there was a much greater messiness. The Bretton Woods conference gave rise to bodies like the IMF, the IBRD. It produced the UN, of course, but also it produced NATO. And this international liberal order, as I see it, had two phases. In the first phase, interestingly, in the Atlantic region, the Keynesian welfare state was very central. The legalization and flourishing of trade unions, the development of universal healthcare systems was part of this, the restrictions on free trade, currency movements, and so on. It was in the 1970s that we have another version of, if the first was a sort of social liberalism, the second is a free market liberalism that flourishes and I think produced the crisis that Marlene and others have talked about. So it's just to say that we still await in this winter school, I think, a good understanding, a good definition of what this so-called international liberal order is. To Karim, playing the role of devil's advocate liberal, I think you're so far the only one who has dared to speak out in this winter school. I mean, I think philosophically, to put it very abstractly, the problem correctly you've put your finger on is when we are analyzing a discourse, a set of principles that call upon the world to be embraced and to acted upon. One way of thinking is, as you do, you want a purification. You want to defend liberalism through a process of purification. You want to say that there's a pure core set of principles, you know, the freedom and equality of the individual, etc., etc., etc. And the instantiations, to use your word, are the corrupting qualities. This is one way of thinking, and I think that for the winter school, it's important that, even though this is an abstract point, that all of us have to think about the plausibility of that approach to liberalism. Might we come away more liberal than we arrived? And we do so because of this purification process. The alternative way of thinking, which is the way I think is more Nietzschean, in Goetz and Dämmerung, you know, how to philosophize with a hammer. Nietzsche says liberalism as a set of ideals reveals what it really is when it's institutionalized, and it destroys liberalism. Well, that's, let's say, an approach that we could call an elective affinities approach, you know, Max Weber. So, to illustrate, is it just coincidental that a pure concept of private property, the right of individuals to own property and to wield that property, sell and buy it as they wish, is it coincidental that it's caught up in processes of capitalist accumulation? Short answer, no. There is an elective affinity. And it seems to me that, to conclude, that these two ways of, so to say, abstract thinking about how to make a judgment about liberalism are at stake in this winter school. It's not for me to be a Protestant preacher and tell you that you should, thou shalt, take the second and the first. But prima facie, on the surface of things, it seems to me intuitively that it's the second approach which is much stronger. And if you do look, we should have a discussion. If you do table the core principles of liberalism, you'll find in every case the instantiation has ruinous effects on liberalism. That's true in its anthropomorphic view of nature. Marlene has been the only one banging on about this. It's true in the affinity between nation, sovereign state thinking. Zionism is an instantiation of liberalism, shocking to say. On empire, it's no accidental that liberals were the champions of empire. This is not just, a corruption of core principles. The core principles themselves predisposed liberals in the world to act in support of these dynamics. And when it comes to private property, I think there's undoubtedly, as liberals themselves, beginning in the last quarter of the 19th century in the European scene, began to say liberal core principles, they're sleeping with capitalist accumulation is destructive of liberal principles and of all that it stands for. But this is again yet another short version of the funeral oration for liberalism that I just started out with, a bit with Irish characteristics. But it's to say, helpfully, I hope, that one can think in two ways about core principles, political principles in this way. You could apply this distinction between purification and, let's say, elective affinities to Marxism. It's a grand historical question. Was Stalinism, a corrupt instantiation of the Marxist principles? I think it's more complicated than that. There's an elective affinity, etc., etc.
Thank you. Sir.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I will go on the line of the devil in this panel, Karim, and fully agree with him, with his comment. Look, pathologies of late modernities, everything, populism, authoritarianism, environmental destruction, I don't think we can attribute it to liberalism. Simply, I did the work about how society has been conceived as only a gathering of human without animal, without a plant, without nature. It's not only in a Western sociology. It's also in a Soviet sociology. In the Chinese sociology, I refer to some work. I mean, that they put emphasis on this. So the same thing. I need to disentangle what belong to liberal values and what belong to capitalism. I mean, especially in its sauvage moment of neoliberalism. I mean, wild moment. So how I think how come liberal democracies produce welfare states that I think more and more we are nostalgic to this time. So in line with Pierre Bourdieu, who curse the welfare state, not the welfare state, the state in Europe, and then when it was an assault against welfare state, suddenly become a full defender. And this is exactly my position. I mean, and here my positionality. I grew up in authoritarian regime in Syria where I got in the prison. I know what is a torture. I am not ready at all to abandon a common language that is happened that liberalism created. I don't want to argue neither with the old regime supporter nor with the new regime that torture is absolutely abhorrent in a universalistic standard. So this is, if you like, this is what worry me a little bit when really we conflate this. I mean, we don't do this disentanglement of what is capitalist, what is colonialism, what is really related to liberal values, because I want, in this crucial moment in the Arab world, I don't see better than, if you like, liberal democracy. Sorry to say this clearly. Liberal, and of course, with all the criticism that we can brought to what is liberal democracy, because otherwise, for instance, now there is a new tone about Ahlul Halli wal Aqd, that there is no election, but I mean to be selected, and this is flirted by some of the supporter of a new Syrian regime. So again, I think we need to locate where liberalism went wrong, and to keep this idea that liberal democracy broadly understood, not in a concrete way, it's really provide common language for humanities. I stop here.
Okay. I would like first to engage some points raised by Faisal first. The issue of the whether we are in a hemispheric order or not. Let me just say that I totally adopt the realist assessment of the situation. What I see is a new Cold Order is definitely different from the old Cold Order between the U.S. or the U.S.-led hemisphere and the Soviet Union. But we have on one side the U.S. and not probably U.S.-led. Maybe there are some states that will join. And on the opposite side, you have China. China has, since the 1990s, and this is something that, we're not talking about quite enough. It has established or co-established over 30 institutions. Yeah. And these institutions, they cover all areas: security, economics, technology, and so on. And of course, the most famous is the Belt on the Road Initiative, Shanghai, the BRICS. It's sitting on a competing multilateral order that some categorize as regional. So basically, what we have is a new Cold Order. On the US side, the US, it's true that it has been withdrawing from, I think, overall 70 organizations, including about 35 organizations in the UN. But at the same time, it has been creating a new organization. It is engaging in selective multilateralism. It has been channeling its energy and funding to what it calls America First institutions. So we definitely have two blocks, and we have the UN in the middle and other organizations, and we are in the middle of competing rivalry, and we don't know. I mean, we don't know how it is going to end. And as I said, Greenland will be a major test. We will see how we are going back to the fight of the hemispheres, which was witnessed during the Cold War, during the Berlin crisis, during the Panama, and I think the Iranian crisis. There were many crises around the hemisphere boundaries, the borderlands between both hemispheres. So we are going through that. On the other issue, on the issue of the, I think there was some confusion. I wasn't talking about the UN Human Declaration, Human Rights Declaration. I was talking about the UN Charter. And the Charter, there's no mention of democracy, and human rights was championed by Latinos, Latina countries and organizations. Let me just go back, talking about Gaza, and I'm happy that Faisal raised this issue. Thinking of the post-liberal order, it is extremely difficult for me to be positive, especially after Gaza. So let me tell you, let me at least reflect probably the point of view of some of the audience of the Middle East, what is called the Middle East, Arab nations or Muslim nations. The value component of this order has been absolutely destroyed. So we cannot talk about a post-liberal or a new liberal order without accountability, revision, and adaptation. This value, this order, which is set on values like human rights, rule of law, democracy, we haven't seen these principles applied, especially in the case of Palestine in general, but in the ongoing genocide. So how can citizens from the region, this region, who have lost, many of them, have lost faith in this value, norm-based order. So it's just, to me at least, it's impossible to continue promoting these principles without explaining who is concerned with this human rights. Who is human or who is not. Basically, Gaza has made us face this issue. What we are witnessing is not. We don't have a problem of the the norms. We have lots of norms. We have a system. We have regulations, treaties, conventions, everything that is needed to face a human rights violation. But what we don't have is the principle of who's human. And unfortunately, what's happening in Palestine and Gaza in particular, it has shown us that this value, this liberal order, doesn't apply to all humans. So probably we need to review, to revise, and how to account this Western, at least the states that still hold to this liberal international order, we have to hold them accountable. And if we are to build something, we definitely have to revise all these principles and come up with something more realistic. I'm a fundamentally realist. So I like the aspirations, I like the ideals, but I would like to see something that is implementable. And here I want to go back to John Keane. And also, it's in line with the same position. I think your take on democracy is a bit romanticized. I find it a bit romanticized.
It was this morning, yes.
Yeah. So
Deliberately.
So I would like. It's definitely it's in line with what I just said. There's also the downside of democracy. There are many issues with democracy. Tyranny of majority, when you have minority groups suffering under democratic rule. Competence of the electorate, when you have electors who make disinformed decisions. You have the influence of money, huge problem of corruption in democratic regimes. We have a problem of instability related to the lack of long-term planning due to electoral cycles. We also have the problem of short-term popular decisions just to help re-elect the authorities or the leaders. There are so many problems with democracy, and I know that probably the best definition is the one that has been given by Churchill. Is the worst. Democracy is the worst form of government, besides those that have been tried from time to time. But still, it definitely needs to be also revised and adapted to the new era that we're going.
You want to say something, Gabor?
I don't know. Should I or?
Yeah, it's your turn. You have a right to.
Yeah. Okay. Just I'll be very quick because I see
Please.
really run out
Please.
of time. So first, I think if you look at the reality of liberal institutions from kind of this relational materials perspective that I'm proposing, then this distinction between abstract ideas and practices is less of a tension. These institutions always evolve in a context of specific power projects. So I always have these debates with my liberal friends in Hungary, how they think of constitutions as these solidification of brilliant ideas, but they are always the product of organized elite groups and social forces and social classes and cross-class coalitions coming together, using some ideas to kind of reach a compromise. And from that perspective, liberalism was always, like all other ideas, more complex than reality can bear, and it's contradictory. So it's always been contradictory. Economic liberalism and the idea of political equality, which some liberals try to embrace at the same time, has always been self-contradicting. And the problem today is that one set of liberals, the majority of them, have kind of sided with the revolting economic elites against the post-war social compromise. And whereas in the early 20th century, they tended to side with lower classes and working classes, these days the hope was, or at least in the last 2-3 decades, the hope was that elites would bring democracy, businesses would bring democracy, peace through trade, economic growth, it's the thing that creates democracy, not organized social pressure. And this also means that this Schmittian emphasis on security, when there were previous institutional configurations that resolved that tension. Polanyi famously had the last part of the Great Transformation as a reflection on freedom in complex societies that by definition has to involve planning. Welfare, strong welfare states, economic planning. Otherwise you don't have freedom. So I think we have to embrace that kind of idea, whichever way you want to call it. Polanyi, maybe you would have called it democratic socialism, but name it the way you want it. I think there were historical examples of it, like kind of at the ideational and institutional level, when there was an approximation of more security and freedom, but there's no way to go back there, right? So that kind of social compromise rested on the idea of the possibility of unlimited growth. And it also created a kind of consumerist society. So we can't go back there. So we need a kind of a new arrangement, the democracy 2.0, a new deal that kind of is inspired by that old deal, but is a new deal that is befitting this imperative of a post-growth society.
And very briefly also, just to maybe begin by seconding John on Karim's comment, I don't see why attacking the realities of liberalism would kind of rescue the principle. That seems to me a way to kind of, where that liberalism is using to avoid being judged and just being excusing just in the name of abstract principle while the realities is different is, I think, too easy because, as John was mentioning, I mean, communism got delegitimized because all the regimes who one way or another refer themselves as communist were all kind of authoritarian systems. So communism got largely delegitimized. So I don't see why liberalism wouldn't have to be responsible for the realities, the institutional and political and social economic realities it has produced. And I think there is an issue with the kind of mythologization of liberalism also as a way to protect itself. If you define it only through kind of equality, freedom, individual, yeah, we all want that to be protected, but you can also think of liberalism as, you know, belief in a kind of linear progress, believe in rationality, believe in kind of secularized public space, believe in capitalism. And in that case, if you frame liberalism like that, you can say, well, it had reached a limit where it seems it doesn't function anymore like that, or at least these core elements that are also philosophically important are kind of clashing with the reality. And I think what, Karim, you were mentioning about the kind of fear and anxiety as being core element, and on that, liberalism as a political philosophy has no answer on that. And I think that's maybe where the weakest point of liberalism, not as a concrete institutional realities, but as a political philosophy, has no answer to some existential issues and has no answer to the meaning people are interested in kind of, or need for their life. And maybe last point on post-liberalism, I think what post-liberalism allow, at least in its democratically oriented version, because I think you, as we were discussing, you have a non-democratic version of post-liberalism, is that it allows us to regain the right to figure point the issue with liberalism, right? And to say, okay, it's not a full rejection of liberal achievement, but it will be a selective recovery. And there is a right to say that things have been going wrong with liberalism and that things needs to be addressed. And I think the relationship to neoliberal capitalism is the key issue. And that's the job of those who believe in liberalism, to come up with the solution. It's not the authoritarian or the liberal that will give them the solution for them. Liberals need to find a way to rethink the way liberalism is merging or fighting or accepting neoliberal capitalism. And I don't see anything coming. I mean, the leftist, the social democratic version of liberalism, both in Europe and in the US, failed at finding any answer. They just have been embracing neoliberalism and trying to regulate, you know, on some issue, but just putting a bandage on the big issue doesn't solve the big issue. So that's their job, and that's where they need to do a really big, you know, inner kind of ideological work on what it means and which kind of political project they can offer if they precisely want to rescue some element of the philosophical principle, but also have to be judged for the realities of what happened concretely, which is that they are married with neoliberal capitalism, and that's where they are getting penalized, at least electorally.
Thank you. Okay, now it's the audience. We open the floor. Please, Dr. Abdul Wahab.
Thank you very much. I would like to compliment the presenters for all of them saying very interesting things. At the same time, blame them for each has condensed the library in few words, so we cannot know where to respond to them. But I will start with a point, which is the relation between democracy and also to a similar degree liberalism and power. I think probably Gabor was who mentioned that these are always compromises. And I think I once made a definition of democracy, which I haven't publicized much yet, which argued that democracy is a power-related compromise, but it's a morally defensible compromise. You cannot imagine that in a democracy or any other system that power can be ignored. Always a relation and balance of power will be there. So it is not pure, as many people would agree, that it is the rule of the people, and also the nice, clean, moral rule of the people. And in a sense, there is always the critique of democracy and of liberalism, that they are not really democratic or they are not really liberal. Nobody says, I mean, the communists, they call themselves democratic government because they say democracy is not real democracy because the majority or the proletariat are oppressed, so it cannot be a democracy. Also, although I agree with Karim a little bit, I was going to say the same point, but call it the advocate of the angels. But my point is that in this sense, liberalism has been the component of democracy which has tried to balance it more in the sense of restraints and and the kind of balance of power to reduce the element of power by putting principles that would restrain the rulers or the holders of power from doing what they are doing now, for example, in many democracies. And finally, I think the role of balance of power has also been shown in the Cold War. I don't think the American regime of the time has accepted, for example, the pressure towards civil rights and black rights if it was not for fear that when they are fighting for international balance of power, and most of the countries are African or black in some sort, that you appear as Americans, you are oppressing black people. It wouldn't sell. So, but interesting thing about also the point of minorities is nowadays these white supremacists in America claim that they are oppressed minorities. People do not allow them to compare their rights. And Trevor Noah had a joke which I finish with when the supporters of apartheid in South Africa were mentioned by Trump as the oppressed minority there who deserve to be brought to America to be refugees. And he said, it's the first time I see refugees with subsidized bags and ones who have left a 5-bedroom home over there. So we have to, it's complex, but I stop here.
Thank you. Yes, please.
شكرا. يعني سأتحدث باللغة العربية حتى أستطيع أن أوصل أفكاري بشكل جيد.
I'm happy to translate.
أعتقد في أدوات الترجمة هناك يعني ماشي. في ترجمة. طيب يعني شكرا. يعني حتاخذوا السماعات يعني بالنسبة للإخوة سأناقشهم.
He will translate.
طيب يعني عندي 3 ملاحظات. أولا فيما يتعلق بمداخلة الأستاذ فيصل، يعني هناك التباس كبير فيما يتعلق بتعريف المفاهيم الليبرالية، الديمقراطية، العلمانية والحداثة، وهذا الالتباس ناتج.
عفوا اسمح لي أعطيني وقت حتى أترجم. First question is to Professor Faisal. There seems to be a confusion between the terms of
العلمانية والحداثة والديمقراطية والليبرالية.
Modernity, liberalism.
Secularism.
I have an idea. Sorry to interrupt. Since we have a translator, let's move to another question. We'll bring the headphones, and this way we won't waste time. I'll go to this side just for a second.
Thank you so much. I'll be very brief, but I really enjoyed this this roundtable, and Karim, I really enjoyed your approach to moderation. So my question is pretty straightforward. My background is in refugee studies, so I always look at things from that lens. I also adopted this lazy position where I blame everything on colonialism, so I blame our problems on someone else. But I find it, and this is my question, me thinking out loud, I'm unable to separate terms like democracy, liberalism, but also colonialism and capitalism, modernism, but most importantly, the notion of the nation state. Like, I can't separate them historically and analytically. I think they are really they enmesh quite a bit. So my question is, are we able to imagine democracy before or after the nation state specifically? Can it exist without this form? Because the nation state is a pretty new invention. right, it's a new human invention. So can it exist before or after a nation state? Thank you.
We'll take Dr. Ilyas, yeah.
A very brief question to John Keane. Following the question that just preceded, is that are you conflating the state with nation state? And I assume that you are not. And if we then rescue the state from the nation state, now we are at the level of ideas, then the state is an actor vis-a-vis other states, and they are competing for natural resources. You have been emphasizing the ecology a lot in the last 3 days, and I really very much in line with Gabor's idea of materiality. Natural resources is very, very important in fights among primates, since primates have arrived, the different tribes of primates and so on. So it is really not new conflict between groups and conflict between states. And so small states have to ally with big states have to exploit them, small states rebel. All these dynamics has nothing to do with all the isms that I have been hearing about. So the idea is, including democracy, is that the big challenge is that we are humans on this planet. We will need to eat and we need to produce, and we have limited resources, and we have to compete and kill each other. And we are in totally a different planet in the last 3-4 days, talking about isms, not really centering the state, and really it has interests, and how does it square with your advocacy, specifically monitor democracy? Thank you for your patience.
Thank you. We'll take 2 more questions. The courageous man, translator, yeah, you, and then in the Arabic, and then maybe another round.
I actually have 4. I don't know if you would be willing to accommodate this.
Choose one.
Man, oh man. Okay. Professor Al-Basri, you said something at the very beginning about the UN becoming weaker than it used to be. Well, actually, there was behind it the story of the UN being built to serve the purpose of 4 policemen around the world. That's what we'd like to refer to in IR as the dark side of power. So my question is, after you went through all these organizations that are replacing certain functions of the UN built by China, the US, and others, what core functions do you think cannot be replaced by any other regional arrangements that the UN can preserve, will always stay there? Do I get another question? Okay. Second one, Professor Keane, you said something that struck a nerve at the beginning, but in a good way. You said democracy has no need of liberalism, and this takes me back to my days of grad school, where I used to hear the term illiberal democracy a lot. So building on that statement, I'd like to know about your definition, or let's say more, if you could sketch the architecture of a democratic state that can function without liberalism. Sorry if you had already answered that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now, okay. Yes.
نعم شكرا. بالنسبة للأستاذ فيصل، يعني الالتباسات التي يعني تطرحها بعض التعريفات.
I've talked about as a result of some of the definitions like democracy, regarding some of the concepts like democracy, liberalism, modernism, etc. They are the results of what is being produced by the Western thought. Edward Said discussed this attempt to impose some sort of a hegemony over other cultures. So therefore, this is something which needs to be clarified. The second point regarding what Dr. John Keane has said, don't you think that we should separate between democracy and liberalism? Democracy is much wider and more accommodating than liberalism. Dr. Sari Hanafi talked about liberal ideology. In our experience in the global south or the Arab world, liberalism has led to a number of catastrophes. Ali al-Mazrou'i is very well known in Africa. He wrote in English, like Edward Said. He talks about one of the constants that move the Arab or African person is the concept of dignity. This is non-existent in the West. When they talk about the West, they talk about liberty or freedom, who is ultimately a white man, a Western man, even if he has the same color as Barack Obama, he carries the thoughts of a white man. If we liberate these concepts from this Western imperialism, we can talk about equality in the world, and also moving from representative democracy, which proved its limitation, move to another form of الآن سنتحدث
answer any of the questions. Yeah.
Well, I can answer the one that was posed to me. But yes, I agree. But of course, these categories have all been assimilated and appropriated in all our societies, though differently. So they may now hold different interpretations, and there are as many contributions to these ideas as there are simply borrowings of them. But I would go further than that. So, since we are here in the Middle East, I can broach the following very similar proposition, which is that Muslim societies outside the Middle East have had to live with what the philosopher Muhammad Iqbal called the problem of Arabian imperialism. That Islam and the Arabic language have so dominated categories of Muslim thought that there is an urgent task to, if you will, decolonialize Islam itself. So Muhammad Iqbal, already in the 1930s, who is a Muslim philosopher, makes a similar point, that Islam needs to rid itself of the stamp of what he calls Arabian imperialism. So you can have many different versions of this argument. But of course, he would not make the case that Islam as it existed, in his case in India, had not assimilated, appropriated, and contributed to the very categories that he wants to question. So, it can go in many different directions.
So to Dina, how would you explain that the French Communist Party was in favor of the colonization in Algeria? So this is, if you like, you need some, if you like, complexity, how you index these colonialism to liberalism to nation state, etc. And the second, I think, absolutely political imaginary now to have a less state, if you like, in political community. This absolutely very important for the Western countries, for the global North. But for the global South, I would say we need more state, if you like. So I think we need to be careful. I mean, in the global North, there is problem not to acknowledge diversity of communities, for instance. While here is communities, take Lebanon, take Syria, take Iraq, and without really a state. So political imaginary here, I would say, we need a nation state.
for the gentleman about the UN, whether the UN, what it needs to survive, what are the core functions that will always be there. Well, first of all, I mean, the good news, despite the grimy picture, is that unlike the League of Nations, which was suspended after 1939, the UN is still functioning, and it has a universal, I mean, it's the only organization that has a near or universal membership, which makes it extremely crucial for the international relations. So I think it will be there, even if the competition between the two blocks that we are witnessing will go further, because the world is interconnected. Because the number of states that we have today, we have 193, compared to the maximum that the League of Nations get, I think it was about 56. So the world is interconnected. The issues that the states, not only the people, but the states also need to face and address, they cannot address them alone, whether it's environment, a refugee problem, humanitarian crisis, economic issues. All these issues cannot be solved or at least discussed and debated outside the UN. Some forms, of course, of offer, especially at the regional level, some problem solving that can be done at the regional level. But major issues are still and will be discussed and treated at the UN. There is also another issue, is that it is so important to have the UN to keep the channel, diplomatic channel, open. That's, when you look at the war of Ukraine and seeing Russia and the US and the other parts debating despite the war, despite being on opposite sides of the war, that is a good news. So I'm not worried about the future of the UN. The UN will be there. It will shrink because it has expanded beyond its limits. There are so many issues. I've worked for the UN for over 12 years, and I can tell you about an incredible list of problem inefficiency, redundancy, waste, you name it. So there is a need to streamline its work, review what it does, what it does best, and continue with that. So that's definitely not a problem. Thank you.
John?
And I think that the Chinese role, which you've emphasized, is all important. You complained to me, Aicha, that the Chinese don't pay on time their contributions. You may know that in 2023, China is now the largest contributor, much larger than the United States. And it's involved in all kinds of UN institutions, peacekeeping forces, where it gets military experience, its involvement in the special organizations. And innovations must not be forgotten. The Kunming, I say again, the Kunming-Montreal biodiversity agreement is a remarkable innovation where 30% of land and then later seas are protected with a redistribution mechanism. This was negotiated through the UN process with China as the president, ironically, on North American soil, where a communist state, let's call it, persuaded a huge majority of states to support it, with the United States abstaining. This is one thing. I would like to say two things. One to our friend about democracy being much wider in terms of footprint and more ecumenical. I think so, and my prediction would be, with no hubris, I think it's a signifier. It's a word, not an ism. Note that is outliving liberalism, and it happens to be more global, just descriptively. Today, almost everybody is a Democrat. Xi Jinping, Maduro will talk democracy from his prison cell, etc. But having said this, and having been accused of romanticization, thank you very much, Aicha. I want to say two things. It does seem to me that in my lifetime, the problems that you table have been noted, and there are efforts to address them. That is, to get at the autoimmune disease dimensions of democracy, the dark sides of democracy. You cite tyranny of majority. Well, actually, there's been a flourishing of rights legislation. Human rights is one of those discourses within democracies and across borders. And the partnership of civil society and democracy as two ideals is geared to overcoming that old 19th century accusation that democracy stands for the tyranny of majority. The question of the competence of elections, actually, on my reading of the contemporary history of democracy, what we've seen since 1945 is the invention of more than 100 new institutions that never existed before in actually existing democracy. And all of them, as far as my research tells me, are about the problem of monitoring power. This is, for example, clear in the field of corruption. You say that democracy is weakened, it's plagued by corruption. Yes, but integrity bodies, accountability mechanisms have been built. They don't function fully in many contexts, but there is a recognition that democracy, can become corrupted. Short-termism, actually, the flourishing in democracies of ecological forms of representation, climate litigation, and so on, is actually contrary to what you say. There is a growing awareness, when it works well, that future generations need to be empowered. They need to be represented in the affairs of the living. Futures commissions, it's a Welsh invention, is one example. The private property question, you don't mention. Democrats have been great champions of, Bill Clinton style, commodification of everything. It does seem to me that the Polanyi problematic is back. The problem is how, in the name of democracy, understood as equalization of life chances and protection of ecosystems, how do democratic mechanisms and the ideals tame unlimited commodification? We had no discussion in the last 3 days of social democracy. It was a serious alternative through the 19th century. Barely one word has been said about it. Some kind of 21st century socialized democracy is an ideal that seems to me to be back. And that, for instance, happens at cities levels. I live in a city in which commodification is not rampant. Public transport, ecological protection, welfare systems for the population are very, very much part of the agenda of this democratically elected local government. Democracy is against empire and colonialism and post-colonialism. Democrats have a bad history of also, like liberals, supporting empires. Tocqueville on Algeria, for example, big champion of it. So first point, some sort of cleansing of the democratic principles to avoid problematic instantiations. This is a third option, by the way, Karim. I think Marlene said it very well. The duty of liberals, self-declared liberals, is to look again at their core principles and ask which of those principles need radical reconstruction and abandonment in some cases. The same with democracy, at least that's what I've tried to do in my work, in order to honestly recognize that democracy did terrible things in certain contexts, but still has this potential to be the great accountability of power mechanism. One last question about the state. It was said widely in post-45 political science, no state, no democracy. I think this is one of the shortest principles. I forgot, it was a Brazilian sociologist of Brazil who said this. Actually, when you look at the history of democracy until today, the relationship with territorial states, as distinct from nation states, is very contingent. The early Greek assembly democracies were born of politai. These are not territorial states in the modern post-Westphalian sense. It's true that electoral democracy's second phase of its reimagining was heavily implicated in territorial states, but not exclusively. Democratic mechanisms and spirit were at work in empires, and for Faisal, I think you are a historian of empire. I think one of the heretical things to say, you mentioned Lord Macaulay, is that in the British Empire, for reasons of the problem of how to control peoples at a distance, things happened in the margins that only very later happened in the heartlands. I happen to have been born in what was considered the paradise of dissent, the model liberal colony of South Australia, where the constitution was actually approved by democratic male vote. Extraordinary. It had a written constitution. It's never happened in Britain, where women got the right to vote and to stand for the first time in the world, where gay rights were, and so on and so forth, where all the streets are named after liberal heroes. This is unthinkable in the heartlands of the empire. So democracy also, played a role in imperial settings. It does seem to me that in trying to reimagine, Marlene calls for this, and others, I think, have sympathy. Sari does also. In reimagining democracy, the task is somehow to think about the spatial, to think in more complex ways about the spatial units in which the spirit of democracy can flourish and be practiced. And it ranges, in my view, this is a way of thinking out of the no state, no democracy metrics. It takes root and it functions today empirically in cities, smaller locales. It's certainly, there are struggles going on within territorial states, but also within regions. The Asia Pacific region is, let's say, energized by cross-border institutions that are really potentially very powerful. It's also an ideal, so to say, that has global ramifications. What would it mean to democratize the UN? This is the Chinese position. The 45 agreement that you described is exhausted, and it's paralyzing the UN. It needs to be broken, etc., etc. So this is just to say that democracy and its punk quality, it doesn't like arbitrary power. It wants accountability. It would like a greater equality of life chances for all, including ecosystems upon which we depend and in which we dwell. Its spirit can function outside this no state, no democracy framework. This requires, I've tried to do it in a modest way, a reimagining of democracy, which it seems to me was born of the disastrous global war of that we call World War II. It was in that decade, to repeat, that the most radical reimagining of democracy took place, and there were many champions of the view that if democracy is confined to territorial states, there will be yet another war, and there will be yet another violence, rounds of violence within territorial states. What we need to do is stretch it to make it, cross-border. This I feel great sympathy for.
Thank you. So we're definitely over time, which allows us to do two things. The first is to apologize. The second is to stay a little bit longer, since anyway we crossed the line. And since we are in winter school, so there is another extra 2 days, I'll just give 2 more minutes just to collect questions, and then maybe the speakers after the session or another day can have a discussion with you. So 2 more minutes just to collect questions, and then everyone go and maybe eat or something. You had your hand up. If it's still up.
I had the question, but I can ask John the break. It's fine.
Okay, thank you for your generosity. Sadeq.
Thank you very much. I'm also minding the time, so I have many questions, but I will just I will raise just one question to Gabor, because I really appreciate the way you brought materiality to the conversation and your definition of democracy as a social compromise. I could relate more to this definition than John's spirit definition of democracy, to the extent that they contradict each other. But my question to you is that you emphasize the impact of deindustrialization for paving the way to for the current crisis in Eastern Europe and other Western countries. But at the same time, we are aware, and I'm sure you know better than me about that, it was not simply deindustrialization, it was relocation of industries to East Asia, China. What seemed to me is that the collapse of the national compromise was a result of an international compromise, like the integrating of China in the world economy. So the crisis in the West was an expense for avoiding a crisis in other countries, India, China, and East Asia. So my question to you, if you agree with me, do you think is it still possible to have a democracy based on a national compromise without a global compromise? Can we imagine this compromise without taking into consideration the global economy itself?
Any other takers? Okay.
My question is going to be for Professor Keane, and it's simply that he has advised us to desist from understanding democracy as the mere process of putting papers in boxes, but rather that it's something, as he described it, ubiquitous, fluid and dynamic, and if I understood correctly, it's something that lurks into individual social relations or dissipates between them. That's how I understood it with respect to the Montesquieu's reference of spirit. My question is, can you expand on this articulation of democracy, and perhaps do you have some sort of imagination regarding a social ontology of democracy that comes into play within this?
Thank you. This side, no one. So we'll take the last question with no answers.
Last question, maybe not last question, but to Marlene. Did I pronounce your name correctly? Did I hear you saying that you grouped fascism at the same par with communism and liberalism as being all are part of the modernity? I wonder about this, and if we think fascism goes back to Nietzsche, and Nietzsche is questioning the ultimate foundation of modernity, how I would like to, not now of course, but I would like to learn more about that.
Okay, I guess we officially end the session. Thank you for the speakers and for the audience for your attention.